Well, interesting day to travel to a place called Tullamore, about, I don't know, 100 kilometers or so from Tuam, to a project site, but finished up there, shall we say, a little earlier than expected. So now I'm beating my way back, but instead of a direct route, I may as well make hay while the sun shines and redirect a wee bit to stop off at some historic places along the way. We're going to cross the Shannon in a wee town called Banagher in County Offaly, home of a very famous friend of mine, and from there then we'll go to a nearby very famous ecclesiastical site. The site was set up in the 6th century by one of Ireland's earliest saints, but went on to become a Benedictine monastery and is famous for its Hiberno-Romanesque architecture. So we'll stop by there on the way and then tip across the country in a leisurely pace in this beast, the wee beastie, as we negotiate the streets and the back roads of Ireland on what has proven to be a glorious late autumn day. Definitely worse things to be doing with your time on a sunshiny day. And the wee beastie was made for days like today, roads like this. You'd never guess the winter was just around the corner. So the Shannon River flows down through the centre of the country, rises somewhere up near the border with Northern Ireland, flows down right through the centre and then flows into the Atlantic near Limerick City. It's the longest river in Ireland and Britain, and as you can see is quite the broad beast. And so over the years, over our centuries of conflict with our dearest neighbours, this river has served as natural barriers, fortification, as crossing point between the Irish, the Gaels and the Normans and the English and all iterations thereof. So that by the 1600s, the bridges that were being built had become more and more fortified as they became more and more strategic to allow armies access from east to west and vice versa. So here on the west side, the Connacht side, we have this little fortification here. That's Fort Falkland, built in the 1620s, right after Ireland had been pacified, after our version of the Jacobite Wars, the Siege of Limerick, and the flight of the Earls, and all of the Gaelic chieftains and their followers and armies had fled to Europe and joined the continental armies, the French and the Austrian and the Spanish, and Ireland was pacified under English rule, quote unquote. This fort was built. Interesting name, Fort Falkland, named after the Earl who was put in charge here, or Lord Falkland, or whatever his name was. And then you've got the Shannon, there she is. And that was the state of play here in Banagher, which is a small town on the border at Offaly and Galway, up until the Napoleonic period, when the French scared the living shite out of the English. And how did they do that? Well, Britannia ruled the waves. They truly did. The French fleets were scattered, they're small, they couldn't go toe-to-toe with the English, and the English ruled the Atlantic trade routes. So you can imagine their surprise when the French managed to sneak an entire invasion force out of the ports of Brittany and northern France, up through the Celtic Sea around the south coast of Ireland, up around the west coast of Ireland, up around past Limerick, past Clare, past Galway, and in a small bay called Killala in 1798, the year of the French, General Humbert landed with 15,000 Frenchies ready to fight for Irish freedom. And they were joined by their Irish allies there, militia, locals, anybody with a grudge and a stick to wave at the English. And a few days later there was a big battle, and the English were put to flight, and that battle became known as the races of Castlebar. So fleet of foot did the English run away. And that French army was essentially undefeated, but unfortunately was also couldn't be reinforced, couldn't be resupplied. So wandered around the centre of the island for a month or two, running out of food, running out of ammunition, until finally they had no choice but to surrender. And they surrendered to the English, but they surrendered under great terms. They surrendered under the terms that they could return to France with their weapons and their colours, the regimental flags, and their promise that their Irish allies would be left unmolested and allowed to return home. The English lived up to half of the agreement. So desperate were they to get that French army out of Ireland that they allowed that French army to return to France fully armed and with their regimental flags, which at that time would have been a big deal. Their Irish allies didn't fare so well. They were executed for treason, more or less on the spot, and that was the end of that. But the English took their notes and realised, like, oh bugger, like, we're in trouble. If this happens again, and if they come with more and with a better supplied army, what will we do? And so in the 1800s onwards they started this massive campaign of fortifying the Shannon. And so on the Connacht side they already had their Fort Falkland, but it's pointing the wrong way. It's pointing towards Leinster. What if the French come again? They'll be coming from the back side of that. That's no good to them. And so over here on the Leinster side, on the east side of the river, they built another fort, Fort Eliza, small cannon emplacement, and you can just see that wall right there. That's all that remains. Well, actually, that's all you can see from this side, but there's actually, the walls still stand there. And that was built in 1812, small garrison of a company of foot, I think about 10 guns, all ready to defend this bridge and hold off any more invading Frenchies and their bowed Irish allies. But that's the Shannon, a highly navigable river, all the way from the mouth in the Atlantic, nearly all the way up to its origins up in the wilds of the borderlands. It has served as a really important access point and communication point and transit point through the millennia, going right back to early settlement, where we have found dugout canoes going back to the Irish Neolithic, sunk and preserved in the bogs on either side. And of course the Vikings used it rather too successfully to attack the large monastic sites that were also located along the Shannon. The Normans used it, but it's also been used against them. It's been the literal breaking point between east and west, to hell or to Connacht, as Cromwell famously said. And so to this day, you know, we on the Connacht side have maintained our good looks and native language, while those on Leinster side, well, God love them, let's just say they haven't. So this is a Martello Tower, which is really interesting. Martello Towers are named after the architect who designed them, and they served as watchtowers, signal towers, and usually they're built up and down the coast. And again, they date from the Napoleonic period, and their function was to keep an eye out for more invading French fleets. And they'd you know, set off a fire on the top, just like the beacons of Gondor, except in this case the Gondorians were the good guys. And they'd have a small little garrison on top, or inside, just to man the fort. Technically it's not even a fort, but as you can see, it's a sturdy bloody construction, and they're small and round. Now, like I said, they're usually found on the coast, so this is one of the few inland Martello Towers. But again, that just speaks to the Shannon and its navigability and sort of the central role it's always played in transport and navigation around Ireland, going right back to the earliest times of prehistory, when we were finding dugout canoes located in, or buried or sunk in the river. But it just speaks to that, like there was every chance that the French would make their way up the river, just like the Vikings had done before them, and the Normans and every other invading force. But there you go, that's the Martello Tower of Banagher, one of the few inland Martello Towers, dating, I'd say, from 1800 or so, probably 1812, the same time as Fort Eliza across the river was built. One of those days, the gig was cancelled, the lads weren't ready for me, so I about faced and I'm heading back. But just crossing the Shannon here, Banagher, the broad majestic Shannon. There's the 17th century fortification in there. Fort Falklands, there's a bit of Napoleonic fortification bit. There's our Martello Tower. It's not a bad old job I have that takes me around this country, and I get to fart about looking at old shite. There's definitely worse gigs out there. So now I'm going to slowly but surely make my way home, but I'm actually pretty close to one of the most famous Romanesque sites in Ireland. Not Roman, Romanesque. Dates from the 1300s, 1400s, Clonfert Cathedral. You might swing by and have a look at it there. There's a doorway that's a little bit famous, and it's also the resting place for one of Ireland's most famous early saints, Saint Brendan. In the meantime, now we just crossed the Shannon, we're back in Connacht, back in civilization. Up Connacht, back in County Galway, even better. Tipping along, lovely day here in September. But it's kind of a funny little country. There's just so much to see and do and visit, and nearly every field has a story to tell. And if I don't know the story, I will make it up for you. Head over this way. Lots of older buildings this side. It's a fine old building there. Oh, it's a schoolhouse or church or God knows what. Anyway, on we go to Clonfert. At last, out of the deep seas he passed, and mist rolled on the shore. Under clouded moon the waves were loud as the laden ship him bore. To Ireland, back to wood and mire, to the tower tall and grey, where the knell of Clonfert's bell tolled in the green Galway, where Shannon down to Loch Derg ran under a rain-cloud sky. St. Brendan came to his journey's end, to await his hour to die. So who do you think wrote that poem? None other than the bold J.R. Tolkien, about St. Brendan, one of our kind of early Irish saints, and an interesting character, Brendan the Navigator. He wrote a book about his adventure, the Navigatio, where himself and a bunch of lads hopped in a boat and headed west, which all the finest Irishmen have been doing ever since. And according to his book, he found a land far to the west across the Atlantic, the Promised Land, which he claimed was America. So here we are at Clonfert Cathedral. This is a monastic site that was founded by Brendan sometime in the 1550s, 1560s. Went on to become a Benedictine site. And here we have like the famous Clonfert Cathedral, St. Brendan's Cathedral. Famous because it has one of the best examples of Hiberno-Romanesque architecture. This door, it's a six framed door. On top, you have this tympasium, bunch of heads, God knows what that's about. Lots of motifs, sadly, that you're beginning to show the effects of time. The door is sandstone, so we're not going to touch it. It's very soft and prone to erosion and weathering. But there's cat engraved all along, cats' heads. Somebody here really loved cats. And then, as an example of the Hiberno-Romanesque, you've got these very typical early medieval motifs and bishops and whatnot, but you also then have on the outer frame like very typical Irish lacework, or native art, insular art if you will. And that's the doorway, and here right in front of the door, the grave of the man himself, St. Brendan, 484 to 578 AD. Very strong associations with Galway, even though he was a Kerry man. But he was up and down Loch Corrib. A lot of those sites mentioned there, monastic sites, are on the banks of Loch Corrib. He would have known St. Benin, whose cathedral and church we've already visited, Little Round Tower. And this is the monastic site and place of learning founded by Brendan himself. On a glorious autumn day, the wind rustling in the trees, and this beautifully kept graveyard. So this main building, the first parts of it are built in the 12th century, the 1100s, added on to right up until the 1600s. I believe the tower was one of the last pieces to be added in the 1600s. But this is a little extension here. I'm not sure what that is. It looks quite old and it's stuck onto the side. We'll have to see if we can have a look at that. But there's the cathedral. There's little bits and pieces of sites left. But where we're standing now would all have been part of the monastic enclosure with buildings and refectories, scriptoriums, and of course cells for the monks as well. I'll have a look through this door, see what's out here. These earthworks are probably no coincidence. I imagine a lot of this is archaeological foundations and remains of the early ecclesiastical site, which likely was surrounded by a circular enclosure. This just opens up here. Ooh, wouldn't you love to open a trench in that field and see what you find? Looks like we're on a bit of a ledge here, so there's something right there, obviously. There you go. Clonfert. Interesting that Tolkien wrote a poem about the man. I'll have to figure out why that happened. But Tolkien used to holiday in Galway quite frequently, and sure, you could see why. Lovely countryside, beautiful people, great weather. It's always like this, I swear. But there we go, Brendan, the first Irishman to get to the States, followed 2,000 years later by this guy. But home again, no more than Brendan. Hopefully not to die quite so soon. Jesus, touch wood. That's some really ancient cellar. What's this, lad? 1832 this fella was planted. Real mix of the old and the new in here. 1839. And then much more recent, 1957. And then you have stones like this. Clearly remains of something that would have been here. A couple of older markers here. was ever an inscription on that. It's long gone, sadly. Looks like it's some type of shale. Yeah, long gone. So it really pays to come to these locations off this tourist season. I'm inside the church, the cathedral here at Clonfert, and I have the place to myself. Not bad. Bunch of Frenchies just left. Today is the day of the French. God bless them. Vive la France and all the rest of it. But here we are now inside the cathedral. Parts of it date to the 1100s. Added to over the years. But here we have, like, that's a very early it's an early Irish cross. And it was added to over the centuries, right up till the 1600s. Now held by the Church of Ireland, who've kept it in great condition and left the door open here today, which was actually really surprising. Many places wouldn't be, but this is open for people to come in and experience and appreciate. That's the inside of the front door now. These early gravestones. That one has a date 1612 on it. Here's some very interesting carvings the church is known for. Mermaid. These little chaps. On the opposite side. Some fantastic stone carvings. How lucky am I to have this to myself? Good grief. Just to wander in and explore this ancient cathedral. Ooh. Well, how can I not go in? Oh, now this is old. This is old. You can see these lines in the wall. That is, there would have been wattle, reeds placed against that and then plastered over for insulation. The reeds are long since gone, but the lines have been left in the original plaster. So if I had to guess, I would guess this building, this section of the building is almost certainly 12th century, maybe 13th. All the way through you can see these striations in the plaster from those original reeds. Oof, this is remarkable. This is crazy. It's sitting here just ready to be explored. Well, thank you, Church of Ireland, for leaving this open. And there's the outer wall of the newer cathedral, you know, this blow-in cathedral from the 1400s. Beautiful tiled floor, but dark, you really can't see that. There we go. Well, for those of us more interested, less in the sacred and more in the profane, just noticed there's a really cool old house across the road from the cathedral. Looking at it, it's showing signs of all sorts of additions and interesting architecture here, but I'm guessing we're looking at something that could easily date from the 16 or 1700s and has been added onto over the years. This taller building here at the end, I would guess, is the original, and then that centre bit I would imagine is late 1700s, early 1800s. It's a fantastic old house. That has a story to tell. I mean, I'd love to know the story of this. That is not your typical vernacular architecture at all. I wonder what's underneath that render. Just as well I don't have a hammer with me. Beware of bull. And it's not the bull I usually fill the air with. Oh, interesting. So we've cypress out here. That could well be an extension of the ecclesiastical site, I wonder. All sorts of bumps and bumps out in that field as well. Another archaeological technical term. Old stuff. Ooh, look at this guy. Look at this gate post. Well, isn't that interesting? Belfast. Musgrave Patent Belfast. With the royal seal on it. Very fancy. A very fancy iron gate post. Hidden here behind the stone bier. What is that about? Oh, and it has a matching partner. Well, well, well. History everywhere. Time to bash on. Allons-y. Well, how's that now? Gate into some former estate, some landlord long since up sticks and returned to Blighty. Again, you know, speaks to the land down here. Big houses, big estates, lots of income. Never driven this road before, but I just passed a bunch of signs with all sorts of height and width restrictions. So that should prove interesting. Not sure what it's ahead of me. Maybe an old railway bridge from one of the many trail lines long since abandoned and disused. Ireland used to have the highest number of railway line per square kilometre in Europe in 1900, and now we've one of the least. In the 1930s, 40s and 50s, the Irish government underwent a huge programme of just shutting down these local railway lines. Unfortunately, trying to replace them ever since. That's an interesting little fella. All sorts of interesting little buildings down. Well, here's our height restriction apparently. The road now goes through what would have been the entrance to an estate. Look at this. A little lodge on either side. Bellevue Gate Lodges. Whatever the hell that is. The house must be behind us. Looks like we're inside the gate now. There you go. Would have been the gate to a former mansion. Downton Abbey style. Before we put an end to all that nonsense with independence. And there's a crossroads outside the gate, and on we go. See if we can get a view of that in the rear view mirror as she disappears behind us. Like her previous owners, eh? Anyway, on we go. Up Galway.